Good evening, dear travelers, and welcome back to Snug As A Bug. I am Atticus, and tonight we delve into an era cloaked in myth and magic. Here, in the midst of legends, stood Camelot, a kingdom unmatched in honor, bravery, and destiny. At its core was King Arthur, the once and future king, surrounded by the legendary Knights of the Round Table, all sworn to a sacred oath of justice and protection for their realm. Camelot was more than just a kingdom of warriors. It was a realm infused with potent magic, from the sagely guidance of Merlin to the mysterious Lady of the Lake and the ominous ambitions of Morgan Le Fay. These mystical forces drove the destinies of Arthur and his knights, propelling them through quests of valor and battles pivotal to the annals of time. This collection revives the epic saga of Camelot, from Arthur's rise to power and Mordred's betrayal to their ultimate destiny-defining confrontation. Each story is interwoven with themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the undying hope that King Arthur will return. Before we begin, close your eyes and picture yourself entering the ancient kingdom of Camelot. The air is crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and distant rain, and there's a faint hum of magic all around. In the distance, the towering stone castle stands proud, bathed in the golden glow of dawn. You walk through the bustling streets of the kingdom, where blacksmiths hammer steel, merchants call out their wares, and the sounds of everyday life echo around you. But soon, your steps lead you toward the heart of Camelot, the grand hall of the Round Table. Inside, the flickering glow of torches casts long shadows on the stone walls. Before you, the legendary Round Table shines, symbolizing unity and honor. Seated at it are the greatest knights the world has known. At the head sits King Arthur, his hand resting on the hilt of Excalibur, the sword gleaming faintly with ancient power. The knights around him, Lancelot, Gawain, and the wise Merlin, are ready, their faces marked by both courage and anticipation. You can feel the weight of destiny in the room, the sense that great battles and quests await. Take a deep breath. You are now part of this legendary world, walking alongside heroes and kings as the journey through Arthurian legends begins. The Sword in the Stone. Chapter 1. The Kingdom in Darkness. In a time long forgotten, when magic still whispered through the forests and the stars guided the fates of men, there lay a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Camelot, once the heart of a prosperous and unified realm, had fallen into shadow. King Uther Pendragon, the last of the great rulers, had died unexpectedly, leaving behind no clear heir to the throne. With his passing, the light of Camelot had dimmed, and the land had become as weary and broken as the hearts of its people. The skies above Camelot were no longer the vivid blue of summer, but a heavy gray that seemed to linger eternally. The sun barely broke through the clouds, casting only faint glimmers of light onto the fields, which had once been ripe with crops, but now lay barren and neglected. Where laughter had once filled the streets of villages, there was now silence. The rivers, which had once sparkled under the warm sun, moved slowly, their waters dark and still, like the quiet hearts of the people who lived beside them. In the great castle of Camelot, the mood was no brighter. The stone walls, which had once resounded with the laughter of nobles and the clatter of goblets, were now cold and quiet. The long hall, where King Uther had once held court, was deserted, save for a few flickering candles that barely cut through the gloom. Nobles from across the land gathered in the council chamber, but their meetings bore little fruit. Voices rose and fell in heated arguments, but no solution could be reached. They spoke of contenders to the throne, of alliances, of battles that might be waged, but without a leader to unite them, their words were empty. "There must be someone," one of the knights muttered, his voice low and despairing. "Someone to claim the throne and restore order." But even as they spoke, deep in their hearts, they knew that the kingdom had fallen into chaos, and only a miracle could restore it to its former glory. Chapter 2: The Prophecy of the Sword. Yet among the whispered voices of despair, there were those who remembered the old prophecies, the legends passed down through generations that foretold of a savior, a king who would rise from obscurity to restore Camelot to its rightful place. The legend spoke of a sword, not just any sword, but one of divine origin, forged by ancient forces beyond the understanding of men. This sword, it was said, had been placed in a stone and bound there by a magic so powerful that no man could remove it. "Whosoever pulls this sword from the stone," the prophecy declared, "shall be rightwise King of England." It was a tale often told by mothers to their children as they sat by the hearth on cold winter nights, or by old men around flickering campfires as the wind howled outside. Most believed it to be a simple myth, a relic of an ancient time. But there were some, those wise in the ways of magic, who knew that the prophecy was no mere fable. Among these was Merlin, the great wizard who had served King Uther faithfully for many years. Merlin was no ordinary man. His powers were vast and mysterious, and his knowledge of the world surpassed that of any other living soul. His long beard, silver as the moonlight, flowed down to his chest, and his eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. Merlin had seen much in his time, and he knew the prophecy of the sword well. He had foreseen the chaos that would follow Uther's death, but he had also seen a glimmer of hope, a hope that lay in a most unexpected place. "The sword waits," Merlin whispered to himself as he gazed into the flames of his hearth. "But the one who will draw it, even he does not yet know his destiny." Chapter 3: A Boy Named Arthur. Far from the troubled lands of Camelot, in a small, peaceful village nestled among rolling hills and deep forests, lived a boy named Arthur. Arthur was no prince, no nobleman. He was simply a squire, living in the house of Sir Ector, a knight of modest means. Sir Ector had taken Arthur in as a child and raised him as his own, though Arthur had never known his true parentage. Arthur's days were filled with the simple, often tedious duties of a squire. He would rise before the sun, his breath visible in the cold morning air as he made his way to the stables to tend to the horses. He would polish Sir Ector's armor until it gleamed, sharpen the swords, and fetch whatever was needed to prepare Sir Kay, Ector's son, for the tournaments and battles in which he would compete. Though Arthur's tasks were menial, he did them with care, for he had a kind heart and a curious mind. There was something about the boy, something in the way his eyes seemed to always be searching for more, something in the way he carried himself with quiet grace. He had dreams, though he often kept them to himself. At night, when the village was asleep, Arthur would slip away to a nearby hill, where he would sit beneath an ancient oak tree and gaze at the stars. The stars, he believed, held the answers to questions he couldn't yet articulate. He would close his eyes and imagine a world beyond the village, a world filled with knights, with quests, with adventure and honor. And though he didn't know why, he often felt as though he were meant for something greater, something beyond the life of a simple squire. Chapter 4. The Arrival of Merlin. One cold winter's evening, as Arthur sat by the fire tending to the horses in the stable, a soft knock came at the door of Sir Ector's home. Arthur, curious, looked up from his work, his hands still covered in straw. The door creaked open, and through it stepped a figure cloaked in darkness. The wind howled outside, carrying with it a light dusting of snow, but the figure seemed untouched by the cold. Merlin had arrived. His robes, dark as the night sky, flowed behind him like a shadow, and his long white beard glistened with the faintest trace of frost. His eyes, bright and filled with ancient wisdom, fell upon Arthur, and in that moment the boy felt as though the wizard could see straight into his soul. "You must be Arthur," Merlin said, his voice soft but filled with power. Arthur nodded, unsure of what to say. He had heard tales of Merlin, tales of his magic, his wisdom, and his role in advising the great kings of the past. But never had he imagined that Merlin would come to his village, let alone speak to him. Merlin stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Arthur's. "There is a great destiny before you," he said, his voice low. "You may not understand it now, but in time you will. For now, trust in the path that lies ahead." Arthur's heart raced as he tried to make sense of Merlin's words. Destiny? He was just a boy, a squire, nothing more. What could Merlin possibly mean? "Remember this night," Merlin said as he turned to leave, "for it is the night that marks the beginning of your true journey." With that, the wizard vanished into the cold night, leaving Arthur standing in the doorway, his thoughts swirling like the snowflakes that drifted down from the sky. Chapter 5. The Tournament of Kings. Winter turned to spring, and with it came the announcement of a grand tournament to be held in Camelot. The tournament would bring together the greatest knights from across the kingdom, each competing for honor, glory, and the chance to prove themselves before the gathered nobles. Sir Kay, eager to test his skill, prepared for the journey, and Arthur, as his loyal squire, accompanied him. The journey to Camelot was long and arduous. The roads were rough, the wind biting, and the nights cold. But Arthur was filled with a sense of wonder as they approached the city. Camelot, with its towering walls and gleaming spires, was a sight unlike any he had ever seen. The streets were alive with the bustle of merchants, travelers, and knights, their armor clinking as they moved through the crowds. For Arthur, it was like stepping into one of the stories he had dreamed of during his nights beneath the oak tree. Everywhere he looked, there were knights preparing for battle, their banners fluttering in the breeze, their swords gleaming in the sunlight. The air was thick with excitement, the scent of roasted meats and fresh bread filling the air as the people of Camelot gathered to watch the tournament. As Arthur and Sir Kay made their way to the tournament grounds, they passed through the town square, and there, in the center, stood something extraordinary. An anvil of stone, ancient and weathered, rested in the middle of the square. Embedded deep within the stone was a sword, its hilt adorned with jewels that sparkled like stars. The blade was smooth and polished, reflecting the light of the sun as it gleamed in the open air. Around the base of the sword a crowd had gathered, their eyes wide with awe. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he read the inscription etched into the stone. "Whosoever pulls this sword from the stone shall be rightwise King of England." Chapter 6. The Sword Forgotten. The tournament began with great fanfare. Knights from all corners of the kingdom had come to compete, and the air was filled with the sounds of clashing swords, the thunder of hooves, and the cheers of the crowd. Sir Kay, confident in his abilities, prepared for his joust, eager to prove his worth in front of the gathered nobles. But as the trumpet sounded, signaling the beginning of the joust, Sir Kay realized something terrible. He had forgotten his sword at the lodging.
"Arthur!"
Kay shouted, his voice tinged with panic.
"Fetch my sword, quickly!"
Arthur, ever the dutiful squire, nodded and ran through the crowded streets, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowds were thick, and he had to weave between them, dodging knights and merchants as he made his way to the lodging. But when he arrived, he found the door locked, and despite his best efforts, he could not find anyone to help him. Panic began to set in. Sir Kay needed his sword, and there was no time to return to the tournament grounds empty-handed. Desperate, Arthur looked around, his mind racing, and then he remembered the sword in the stone. Without a second thought, Arthur hurried back to the square, where the sword still gleamed in the sunlight. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but a few onlookers remained, their eyes watching in curiosity as Arthur approached the stone. Chapter 7. The Moment of Destiny. Arthur stood before the stone, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The sword seemed to call to him, its presence drawing him closer. He could feel the weight of the prophecy hanging in the air, as if the very world had been waiting for this moment. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the hilt. The moment his hand made contact with the sword, a strange feeling washed over him, an overwhelming sense of calm, as though the universe itself had stilled, waiting for what was to come. The noise of the tournament grounds, the bustling of the crowds, all seemed to fade into the background, leaving only Arthur and the sword. Without hesitation, Arthur wrapped both hands around the hilt and pulled. The sword slid free from the stone, as if it had been waiting for him all along. There was no resistance, no struggle. It was as though the sword had always belonged to him. A gasp rose from the few remaining onlookers, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen many knights, many noblemen try to pull the sword from the stone, each failing to even budge it. But here before them stood a boy, this unknown squire, holding aloft the legendary sword. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Arthur stood there, the sword gleaming in the sunlight, its blade reflecting the sky above. He felt the weight of destiny settle upon his shoulders, though he could not yet fully comprehend its meaning. Chapter 8. The Revelation. Word of Arthur's feat spread like wildfire through the streets of Camelot. The tournament was temporarily halted as the nobles and knights gathered in the great hall of the castle to witness the boy who had pulled the sword from the stone. The hall, which had once echoed with silence and despair, was now filled with murmurs of awe and disbelief. At the head of the room stood Merlin, his face calm, but his eyes shining with pride. He had known this day would come, had foreseen it in his visions, but now, seeing the boy before him, the boy who had drawn the sword, Merlin felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "This boy," Merlin said, his voice echoing through the hall, "is no ordinary squire. He is the son of Uther Pendragon, the rightful heir to the throne of Camelot." A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Arthur, standing in the center of the hall with the sword still in his hand, could hardly believe what he was hearing. Uther Pendragon, the king, his father? I'm no king, Arthur stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a squire. Merlin stepped forward, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. You have been chosen, Arthur, he said gently, not by birthright, but by your heart. The sword you hold is not just a weapon, it is a symbol of hope, of unity, and of the future. You are the king this land needs. Arthur looked down at the sword in his hand, the weight of it now feeling much heavier than before. Could it really be true? Could he, a boy who had grown up in a small village, truly be the king of Camelot? The knights and nobles, one by one, knelt before him, pledging their loyalty to the new king. And though Arthur still felt unsure, he could not deny the pull of destiny. He had been chosen, and now he had to rise to meet his fate. Chapter 9. The Dawn of a New Era. With the sword in hand, Arthur ascended the throne of Camelot. The kingdom, once shrouded in darkness and despair, began to bloom once more. The fields, which had long lain barren, sprang to life with new crops. The rivers, once slow and dark, flowed clear and strong again, and the people, who had lived in fear and uncertainty for so long, now looked to their new king with hope in their hearts. But even as Camelot began to thrive under Arthur's rule, shadows gathered on the horizon. Dark forces, long dormant, stirred in the depths of the forests, waiting for the right moment to strike. Arthur's journey was only just beginning. Though he had claimed the sword and the throne, many trials lay ahead. For the legend of the Knights of the Round Table was yet to be written, and the greatest challenges were still to come. The Knights of the Round Table. Chapter 1. The Vision of Unity. King Arthur stood on the grand stone balcony of Camelot's castle, staring out at the golden morning that was just beginning to touch the world with its first rays. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the gentle scent of dew on the wildflowers and the faint sounds of birds awakening. Below him, the streets of Camelot were still silent, the kingdom resting under a blanket of peace that the early dawn always seemed to bring. Arthur's heart was heavy, though the sight before him was serene. He rested his hands on the cold stone of the balcony, the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders. It had been several years since he had drawn the sword from the stone, several years since he had taken the throne of Camelot and ushered in an age of peace. The kingdom was thriving, the people were safe, and the land, for now, was free from war. Yet Arthur could not escape the feeling that something was missing, some element of his rule that had not yet taken shape. Ruling alone, even with the support of his advisors and trusted knights, had become a burden that weighed upon his soul. He knew he was destined to lead, but leadership required more than just the ability to make decisions and enforce the law. It required unity. It required others, great men who could stand beside him, not as subordinates, but as equals. Arthur sighed deeply, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. His breath fogged slightly in the cold, swirling up into the soft light of dawn before fading away. As he exhaled, he felt something shift within him, a thought, an idea, a vision that had been lingering in the depths of his mind for some time. A table, a round table. He closed his eyes and let the vision expand. He saw a table, wide and strong, with no head or foot, where every man who sat at it was equal in voice and stature. He saw knights gathered there, not just as warriors, but as brothers, men who would uphold the same code of honor, who would fight for justice, who would protect the weak and defend the helpless. These knights would not serve him out of fear or obligation. They would serve because they believed in the ideals that Camelot stood for. Arthur opened his eyes, the vision still clear in his mind. The sky had brightened slightly, the golden light of dawn spreading across the land like a warm, comforting blanket. His heart felt lighter now, as if he had glimpsed the future and found the missing piece he had been searching for. He turned away from the balcony and strode back into the castle, his steps light and purposeful. The time had come to gather the greatest knights of the land, to form a brotherhood that would stand the test of time. He would build the Round Table, and in doing so, he would build the foundation upon which Camelot's future would rest. Chapter 2. A Call to Arms. Later that morning, Arthur summoned Merlin to his chambers. The wizard arrived silently, as was his way, his long robes brushing the stone floor with a quiet whisper. His staff, intricately carved with ancient runes, tapped lightly against the ground as he walked. His silver beard, long and flowing, framed a face that was wise beyond measure, his sharp eyes glinting with the knowledge of countless lifetimes. "You have been thinking," Merlin said before Arthur could speak, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Arthur chuckled softly, used to Merlin's uncanny ability to know his thoughts. "Yes, I have," he replied, turning to look out the tall windows that overlooked the courtyard. "I've been thinking about the future of Camelot, about the weight of leadership, about how alone it can feel." Merlin stepped closer, his gaze following Arthur's out toward the sprawling kingdom. "Leadership is a burden," the wizard said quietly, "one that no man can carry alone for long." Arthur nodded. "I know, and that is why I've come to a decision." He turned to face Merlin fully, his expression resolute. "The kingdom needs more than a king. It needs men of honor, men who can share in the responsibility of upholding justice, protecting the innocent, and leading with courage and wisdom." Merlin's eyes gleamed with understanding. "You speak of the Round Table." Arthur smiled faintly. "Yes, the time has come to make it a reality. But I cannot do it alone, Merlin. I will need your guidance." Merlin's smile widened, and he nodded in approval. "A wise decision, Arthur. The Round Table will be more than just a symbol. It will be a beacon of hope for the people of Camelot. A reminder that even in times of darkness, there are those who will stand for what is right." Arthur felt a sense of relief wash over him at Merlin's words. "I will need the greatest knights in the land," he said thoughtfully, "men who are not only skilled in battle, but who are also wise, loyal, and honorable." "And you shall have them," Merlin assured him. "I will send out the call to the far corners of the kingdom. The bravest and most noble knights will come. They will gather here, and together you will forge a new future for Camelot." Arthur's heart swelled with hope. "Thank you, Merlin. I trust in your wisdom." Merlin's expression softened, and for a moment his sharp eyes seemed to gaze into the distance, as though he were seeing something far beyond the present. "The future is always in motion, Arthur," he said quietly, "but I believe that the Round Table will be the foundation upon which your kingdom will stand for generations to come." With those words, Merlin turned and left the chamber, his footsteps fading into the quiet halls of the castle. Arthur stood alone for a moment longer, his mind filled with visions of the knights who would soon come to Camelot, men of courage and honor, men who would stand by his side as brothers. The sun had fully risen now, casting a warm golden light over the kingdom. A new day had begun, and with it, a new chapter in Camelot's history. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Lancelot. Weeks passed, and the call went out across the land. Messengers rode to every corner of the kingdom, carrying the summons of King Arthur to the bravest and noblest knights. The journey to Camelot was long and treacherous for many, but the allure of the Round Table drew knights from distant lands, eager to prove themselves worthy of a place among Arthur's chosen. Among the first to answer the call was Sir Lancelot du Lac, a knight whose name was spoken with awe throughout the kingdom. Lancelot was not just any knight. He was a legend in his own right, known for his unmatched skill in combat, his unwavering loyalty, and his deep sense of honor. It was said that Lancelot had been raised by the Lady of the Lake, and that his sword, like Arthur's Excalibur, had been forged by magical hands. The day of Lancelot's arrival was bright and clear, the sky a perfect expanse of blue with only the softest wisps of clouds. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the soft murmur of life in the bustling streets of Camelot. The people whispered among themselves as word spread that Lancelot was approaching the city. Arthur stood in the courtyard, the tall gates of Camelot open wide as he awaited the arrival of the Grisate knight. His heart beat with anticipation, for he had heard much of Lancelot's deeds, of the battles he had fought, of the foes he had vanquished, and of the unshakable loyalty he had shown to those he served. At last, Lancelot appeared on the horizon, riding a magnificent white stallion that moved with the grace of a dancer. His armor gleamed in the sunlight, polished to a mirror finish, and the pennant on his lance fluttered proudly in the breeze. His helmet, adorned with the symbol of a silver lake, glinted as he rode closer. As Lancelot approached the gates, he dismounted with practiced ease, his movements smooth and deliberate. He removed his helmet, revealing a face that was both strong and noble. His dark hair fell in waves around his shoulders, and his eyes, a deep and piercing blue, met Arthur's with a steady, respectful gaze. Without a word, Lancelot knelt before Arthur, his head bowed in a gesture of humility. "My king," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "I have come to serve." Arthur stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Lancelot's shoulder. "Rise, Sir Lancelot," he said warmly. "There is no need to kneel. Here at the Round Table we stand as equals." Lancelot rose to his feet, his eyes meeting Arthur's once more. There was a moment of silence between them, a moment in which words were unnecessary. Arthur could sense the depth of Lancelot's loyalty, the strength of his character. He knew, in that instant, that Lancelot would be more than just another knight. He would be a brother, a confidant, and one of Arthur's greatest allies. The two men stood side by side as the sun shone down upon Camelot, casting long shadows across the courtyard. It was a moment of profound importance, a moment that would be remembered for years to come. The Round Table was beginning to take shape. Chapter 4. A Brotherhood Forms. As the weeks turned into months, knights from across the kingdom and beyond began to arrive in Camelot, each answering the call to join the Round Table. They came from distant lands, bringing with them tales of their bravery, their loyalty, and their dedication to the code of chivalry that Arthur sought to uphold. Among the first to arrive after Lancelot was Sir Gawain, a knight whose loyalty to Arthur was already well known. Gawain was a man of deep conviction, and his courage in the face of danger was unmatched. His red hair gleamed like fire in the sunlight, and his bright green eyes were always filled with determination. He had fought in many battles alongside Arthur, and his devotion to the king was unwavering. Then came Sir Percival, a young knight from the northern mountains, whose heart was as pure as the snow that capped the peaks of his homeland. Percival had grown up in the wilderness, far from the courts and cities of men, but his natural grace and humility set him apart from the moment he arrived. His innocence and untainted spirit would come to be one of the greatest strengths of the Round Table. And finally, there was Sir Galahad, the son of Lancelot, who was said to be the most pure-hearted of all knights. Galahad's arrival was a moment of great anticipation, for it had long been foretold that he would play a key role in the future of Camelot. His armor, gleaming silver in the light of the afternoon sun, seemed almost otherworldly, and his pale blue eyes held a serenity that few could match. As each knight arrived, they were welcomed with open arms, their skills and virtues recognized by Arthur and the other knights who had already gathered. Together, they trained in the castle's courtyard, their swords clashing in friendly competition as they honed their skills. The sound of steel ringing against steel echoed through the halls of Camelot, a constant reminder of the strength that the kingdom had gathered. In the evenings, the knights would gather in the great hall, sharing stories of their adventures, their triumphs, and their struggles. There was laughter and camaraderie, and a deep sense of brotherhood began to form among them. They were not just warriors. They were friends, bound by a common cause and a shared belief in the ideals of Camelot. Arthur watched over them with pride, his heart swelling as he saw the bonds forming before his eyes. These men were not just his knights, they were his family, and together they would create a legacy that would endure for generations. Chapter 5. The Code of Chivalry. But Arthur knew that it was not enough for the knights to simply gather. They needed more than just a shared belief in the ideals of Camelot. They needed a code to guide them, a set of principles that would define what it meant to be a knight of the Round Table. And so one evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the shadows lengthened across the kingdom, Arthur called the knights together in the great hall. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the soft murmur of conversation. Arthur stood at the head of the Round Table, his hands resting on the smooth, polished wood. The knights, each dressed in their finest armor, sat around the table, their faces serious and focused. The light of the fire danced in their eyes, reflecting the deep sense of purpose that filled the room. "We have gathered here not just as knights," Arthur began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We have gathered here as brothers bound by a common cause. But it is not enough for us to simply fight together. We must live by a code that will guide us in all that we do." The knights listened intently, their eyes fixed on Arthur as he spoke. "This code," Arthur continued, "is not just a set of rules. It is a way of life. It is a promise that we make to ourselves, to each other, and to the people of Camelot. We must be brave in the face of danger, but we must also be kind and compassionate. We must be strong, but we must also show mercy. We must seek justice, but we must also be fair and humble." As Arthur spoke, the words seemed to resonate deep within the hearts of the knights. They knew that this was no ordinary code. This was something greater, something that would bind them together as a brotherhood, not just in battle, but in life. When Arthur finished speaking, the room was silent, save for the soft crackling of the fire. The knights looked at one another, their faces solemn, their hearts full of the weight of the moment. Slowly, one by one, they rose from their seats, their swords drawn as they pledged their loyalty to the code of chivalry. The sound of steel ringing through the air was like a symphony, a song of honor and duty that echoed through the great hall. Arthur watched as each knight made their pledge, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment he had worked for. The Round Table was more than just a group of warriors. It was a brotherhood bound by a shared belief in justice, honor, and the protection of the weak. Chapter 6. The First Quest. With the code of chivalry firmly in place, the Knights of the Round Table set out on their first great quest. It was not long before rumors began to spread throughout the kingdom of a great beast terrorizing a distant village. The creature, a dragon with scales as black as night and breath as hot as fire, had descended upon the village without warning, leaving destruction in its wake. Homes were reduced to ash, and the people lived in constant fear, hiding in the shadows and praying for a savior. Arthur could not stand by and let his people suffer, and so he called upon the bravest of his knights, Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad, to join him on the quest to defeat the dragon. The journey to the village was long and treacherous, the path winding through dense forests and across roaring rivers. But the knights were undeterred, their hearts filled with the determination to protect the people of Camelot. As they approached the village, the air grew thick with smoke, the stench of burning wood and flesh filling their nostrils. The ground beneath their feet was scorched, the remnants of homes still smoldering in the distance. The villagers, pale and trembling, emerged from their hiding places as they saw the knights approaching, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Please!" one of the villagers cried, falling to his knees before Arthur. "The dragon, it comes in the night, and we have no way to defend ourselves. We have lost everything." Arthur knelt beside the man, his hand resting on his shoulder. "Fear not," he said softly. "We are here to protect you. The dragon will harm you no more." The villagers watched in silence as Arthur and his knights made their way toward the cave where the dragon had made its lair. The sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow across the landscape as the knights prepared for the battle ahead. The cave was dark and foreboding, the air inside cool and damp. The ground was littered with the bones of animals, the stench of death hanging heavy in the air. The sound of the dragon's breathing echoed through the cavern, a low rumble that sent shivers down the spines of the knights. Lancelot, ever fearless, led the way, his sword drawn and his eyes sharp. Gawain followed closely behind, his hand steady on the hilt of his blade. Galahad, his heart pure and untainted by fear, moved with the grace of a man destined for greatness. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the sound of the dragon grew louder, its presence more oppressive. And then, without warning, it appeared. The dragon was massive, its scales shimmering in the dim light of the cave, its eyes glowing like embers. Its wings, as wide as the cave itself, stretched out as it reared back, letting out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. But the Knights of the Round Table were not easily cowed. They stood their ground, their swords raised, their hearts filled with the courage of men who knew that the fate of their kingdom rested on their shoulders. The battle that followed was fierce and relentless. The dragon's fiery breath filled the cave with smoke and heat, its claws swiping through the air with deadly precision. But Lancelot, with his unmatched skill in combat, moved like a shadow, his sword cutting through the air with the speed of a falcon. Gawain fought with the strength of a man possessed, his blade striking again and again as the dragon let out a roar of pain. And Galahad, pure of heart, struck the final blow, his sword piercing the dragon's heart with the precision of a man guided by destiny. As the dragon fell, its body collapsing to the ground with a deafening thud, the knights stood victorious. Their armor was scorched, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits remained unbroken. Chapter 7. A Seat of Honor. The village was saved, and the people of Camelot rejoiced as news of the knights' victory spread throughout the kingdom. The dragon, a symbol of destruction and fear, had been vanquished, and peace had been restored. Arthur and his knights returned to Camelot as heroes, their bond stronger than ever before. The Round Table had proven itself to be more than just a symbol. It was a living, breathing brotherhood, bound by honor, by duty, and by the love they held for their king and their kingdom. But even as they celebrated their victory, Arthur could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The knights had faced their first challenge, but there were greater tests yet to come. Tests that would push them to the very limits of their strength, their loyalty, and their faith. In the great hall of Camelot, Arthur stood before the Round Table, his knights gathered around him. The flickering light of the torches cast long shadows on the stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the warmth of camaraderie. "Today we have proven ourselves," Arthur said, his voice filled with pride. "But know this, our journey is far from over. There will be more battles to fight, more quests to undertake, but I believe in each and every one of you. Together, we will build a kingdom that will stand the test of time." The knights raised their swords in unison, their voices echoing through the hall as they pledged their loyalty to Arthur and to the Round Table. But even as they did so, Merlin, standing in the shadows, could sense the dark forces that still lingered on the horizon. The future of Camelot was bright, but it was not without danger. Chapter 8. The Road Ahead. As the fires burned low and the celebrations began to quiet, Merlin approached Arthur, his face grave with concern. "You have done well, Arthur," the wizard said, his voice low. "But know this, the greatest challenge is yet to come." Arthur frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean, Merlin?" "There is a darkness gathering," Merlin continued, his eyes distant as though he could see something far beyond the present moment. "A darkness that will test the very foundation of all that you have built. The bonds you have forged, the strength you have gathered, it will all be tested in ways you cannot yet imagine." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, but he nodded, his heart resolute. "Whatever comes, Merlin, we will face it together. The Round Table stands united." Merlin's eyes softened, but his gaze remained distant. "I hope that is true, Arthur, for the future of Camelot depends on it." And so, as the fires of Camelot's great hall burned low, and the knights settled into their seats at the round table. The shadow of a future challenge loomed ever closer. The legend of the Round Table had only just begun, but the greatest trials lay ahead. The Lady of the Lake, Chapter 1, The Enchantment of Avalon. It was a quiet morning in Camelot. The mist hung low over the rolling hills, curling lazily around the trees like the fingers of a dream. The castle's high stone walls glistened with dew, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a pale gold light over the land. The air was cool and damp, and the faint scent of wildflowers mixed with the earthy fragrance of the soil. In this early hour, Camelot was still asleep, save for a few watchmen who stood at their posts, their breath fogging in the cold air. King Arthur, however, was already awake. He stood on the balcony of his chamber, his hands resting on the stone railing as he gazed out over the landscape. His heart was heavy with thoughts of the future, thoughts of the kingdom, of the responsibilities that weighed upon him. The peace that had settled over Camelot since the establishment of the Round Table was fragile, and Arthur knew that it could be shattered at any moment. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard below, rustling the leaves of the oak trees that lined the path. Arthur closed his eyes and breathed deeply, trying to calm the storm of worries that raged inside him. But even the serenity of the morning could not ease his mind. Merlin had warned him many times of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, forces that sought to undermine all that Arthur had built. And yet, despite the wizard's warnings, Arthur felt powerless to prevent the unseen threats from closing in on Camelot. He was the king, yes, but he was also a man. Just one man in a world filled with magic, mystery, and danger. As he stood there, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Your Majesty!" Arthur turned to see Merlin standing in the doorway, his staff in hand, his silver beard shimmering in the early morning light. The wizard's eyes were sharp and knowing, as though he could see straight into Arthur's soul. "Good morning, Merlin," Arthur said softly, his voice tinged with weariness. "I did not expect you so early." Merlin stepped onto the balcony, his gaze drifting out over the mist-covered hills. "I sensed that you were troubled, Arthur," he replied. "The weight of the crown has grown heavier, has it not?" Arthur sighed, nodding slowly. "Yes, it has. I cannot shake the feeling that something is coming, something beyond my control." Merlin was silent for a moment, his eyes distant, as though he were peering into the future. "There is much that lies beyond our control," he said at last, "but not all forces are against you. There is one who may be able to help you in the days ahead, one whose power rivals even my own." Arthur's brow furrowed. "Who do you speak of?" Merlin turned to face him, his expression serious. "The Lady of the Lake." Chapter 2, The Journey to the Lake. The Lady of the Lake. The name was like a whisper, a thread woven through the legends and myths that surrounded Camelot. Arthur had heard tales of her beauty, her power, and her connection to the ancient magic that flowed through the land. She was said to dwell in the depths of a hidden lake, a lake shrouded in mist and mystery, where the waters sparkled with magic and the air hummed with the energy of the unseen world. But despite the many stories, Arthur had never encountered her himself. She was a figure of legend, one whose presence was felt, but rarely seen. And yet, Merlin's words stirred something deep within him, a sense of destiny, of fate drawing him toward her. "I must meet her," Arthur said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "If she can help Camelot, I must seek her out." Merlin nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "The journey will not be easy. The path to the lake is hidden, known only to a few, but I will guide you." Without hesitation, Arthur prepared for the journey. He donned his armor, his sword Excalibur hanging at his side, its blade gleaming with an ethereal light. As he mounted his horse, the weight of the decision settled upon him. This was no ordinary quest. This was a journey into the unknown, into the heart of the magic that surrounded Camelot. Merlin led the way, his staff tapping softly against the cobblestones as they left the castle. The road was long and winding, leading them through dense forests where the trees seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to change. It became thicker, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of Arthur's neck stand on end. As they traveled, Arthur's thoughts drifted to the legends he had heard about the Lady of the Lake. It was said that she was as old as the land itself, a being of immense power who had seen the rise and fall of many kings. She was neither good nor evil, but a force of nature, wild, untamed, and unpredictable. "What should I expect when I meet her?" Arthur asked, his voice quiet as they rode through the twilight of the forest. Merlin glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "She is not like us, Arthur. She is bound to the magic of the earth, and her ways are not the ways of men. She may test you, she may challenge you, but she is not your enemy." Arthur nodded, though a knot of unease twisted in his chest. He was no stranger to danger, no stranger to challenges, but the unknown nature of the Lady of the Lake filled him with a sense of apprehension. Chapter 3. The Lake of Mysteries. After several days of travel, they finally reached their destination, a secluded lake nestled deep within the heart of the forest. The waters were as still as glass, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. Mist curled across the surface, swirling in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive, and the air was heavy with the scent of water lilies and damp earth. Arthur dismounted his horse, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, moss-covered ground. The lake was beautiful, but there was something otherworldly about it, something that made the air hum with tension. He could feel the magic here, thick and tangible, like a living thing that watched and waited. "This is it," Merlin said, his voice low and reverent. "The Lake of Mysteries, the lady resides within." Arthur took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped closer to the water's edge. The surface was so smooth, so perfect, that it seemed almost unnatural. He could see his reflection clearly in the water, but there was something else. A movement beneath the surface, a shadow that flickered just out of sight. He knelt by the water, his hand hovering above the surface. The mist clung to his skin, cool and damp, and for a moment he hesitated. What if the lady refused to help him? What if she saw him as unworthy? But before he could pull away, the water began to ripple. The mist thickened, swirling around him in delicate tendrils. And then, from the depths of the lake, she emerged, the Lady of the Lake. Chapter 4. The Lady's Presence. Arthur had heard of her beauty, but no words could have prepared him for the sight before him. The Lady of the Lake rose from the water as though she were a part of it, her form graceful and fluid, her skin as pale as moonlight. Her long dark hair cascaded down her back in waves, and her eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe, shone with an ethereal light. She was clad in a gown of silver, the fabric rippling like water as she moved, and her bare feet barely touched the surface of the lake as she walked toward him. There was a stillness to her, a quiet power that radiated from her very being, and Arthur felt as though he were in the presence of something far greater than himself. The lady stopped before him, her gaze steady and unblinking. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, like the sound of a distant bell. "King Arthur," she said, her words carrying with them a weight that made Arthur's heart pound in his chest. "You have come to seek my aid." Arthur rose to his feet, his breath catching in his throat as he met her gaze. There was something about her, something that made him feel both vulnerable and honored, as though she could see into the deepest corners of his soul. "Yes," Arthur replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Camelot is in need of your help. There are forces that seek to destroy all that we have built, and I fear that I cannot face them alone." The lady studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The mist continued to swirl around her, casting strange shadows on her face, but her eyes never wavered. "You are a good king, Arthur," she said at last, "but even the greatest of kings cannot stand against the tide alone." Her words, though gentle, cut through Arthur like a blade. He had always known that he could not protect Camelot on his own, but hearing it spoken aloud by the Lady of the Lake made the reality of it all the more stark. "I am willing to do whatever is necessary to protect my people," Arthur said quietly, "even if it means seeking aid from the ancient forces of the world." The lady smiled then, a small, knowing smile that held both wisdom and sadness. "You are wise to seek help," she said, "but be warned, Arthur, the path you walk is not without its dangers." She raised her hand, and from the mist a sword began to emerge. Its blade was long and gleaming, its hilt adorned with intricate designs that glinted in the pale light. The sword seemed to hum with power, a power that called to Arthur, resonating deep within his soul. "This sword," the lady said, her voice soft, "is no ordinary weapon. It is Excalibur, the sword of kings. With it you will have the strength to face the challenges that lie ahead. But remember, Arthur, power alone will not save you. It is your heart, your honor, that will determine the fate of Camelot." Arthur stared at the sword, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel its power, its ancient magic, and he knew that this was no ordinary gift. This was a test of his worthiness as a king. With a deep breath, Arthur reached out and took the sword from the lady's hand. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, a surge of energy shot through him, filling him with a strength unlike anything he had ever known. Excalibur was his, and with it, he would protect Camelot. The lady watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. "Go now, King Arthur," she said softly, "and may the strength of Excalibur guide you." Chapter 5. The Power of Excalibur. Arthur returned to Camelot with Excalibur by his side. The journey back was different from the journey to the lake. Where once Arthur had felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him, now he felt a sense of calm, a sense of purpose. The sword hung at his side, its presence a constant reminder of the lady's words. "It is your heart, your honor, that will determine the fate of Camelot." The magic of Excalibur was undeniable. Arthur could feel it in his bones, in his blood. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope for the people of Camelot. It was a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was light to be found. But as powerful as Excalibur was, Arthur knew that the sword alone could not save Camelot. The lady's warning echoed in his mind. Power alone will not save you. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Arthur knew that the forces Merlin had spoken of, the dark forces that sought to destroy Camelot, were growing stronger. He could feel the tension in the air, the unease that had settled over the kingdom like a shadow. But with Excalibur in hand, Arthur felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 6. The Dark Forces Gather. The peace in Camelot did not last long. Soon, rumors began to spread of strange occurrences in the far reaches of the kingdom. Crops withering overnight, rivers running dry, and villages disappearing without a trace. It was as though a dark cloud had settled over the land, and with each passing day, the sense of dread grew stronger. Arthur's heart ached for his people. He had worked so hard to build a kingdom of peace, a kingdom where justice and honor prevailed. But now it seemed that the very foundations of Camelot were being tested. Merlin was troubled as well. The wizard had spent many nights in his tower, peering into the future, trying to uncover the source of the darkness that threatened Camelot. But the visions were unclear, clouded by shadows that danced just beyond his reach. "The time has come, Arthur," Merlin said one evening, his voice heavy with concern. "The forces we have feared are gathering. They will not stop until Camelot is destroyed." Arthur nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "We will face them," he said. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." Merlin's eyes gleamed with a mix of pride and sadness. "You have grown into a great king, Arthur, but remember, even the greatest kings need allies." Arthur knew what Merlin was referring to. The Lady of the Lake had given him Excalibur, but her aid did not come without a price. The ancient forces of the world were unpredictable, and Arthur knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger. Chapter 7. The Return to the Lake. As the dark forces closed in on Camelot, Arthur knew that he had to return to the Lake of Mysteries. The Lady of the Lake had warned him of the dangers that lay ahead, and now more than ever, he needed her guidance. With Merlin by his side, Arthur set out once again on the long journey to the hidden lake. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds had fallen silent. When they finally reached the lake, the mist was thicker than ever, swirling across the surface like a living thing. Arthur knelt by the water's edge, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. "Lady of the Lake," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I seek your counsel once more." For a moment, there was only silence. The water was still, the mist unmoving. But then, slowly, the surface of the lake began to ripple, and from the depths, the Lady of the Lake emerged once more. Her eyes were filled with a deep sadness as she gazed upon Arthur. "You have returned," she said softly, "but the path you walk is fraught with peril." Arthur bowed his head. "I fear for Camelot. The darkness is closing in, and I do not know if I am strong enough to protect my people." The lady's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You are strong, Arthur, But strength alone is not enough. You must have faith. Faith in yourself and faith in those who stand beside you. Arthur looked up, meeting her gaze. What must I do? The lady's expression was grave. The dark forces that seek to destroy Camelot are powerful, but they are not invincible. There is a way to defeat them, but it will require great sacrifice. Arthur's heart clenched at the word sacrifice. He had known deep down that this journey would not be without cost, but he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his people. "I will do whatever is necessary," he said, his voice steady. The lady nodded, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. "Then go, Arthur. Return to Camelot and face the darkness head-on. And remember, Excalibur is more than just a sword. It is a symbol of hope, of justice, and of the light that burns within you." Arthur rose to his feet, his heart filled with both determination and dread. He knew that the battle ahead would be unlike any he had faced before, but with Excalibur in hand and the lady's words echoing in his mind, he felt ready to face whatever darkness awaited him. Chapter 8. The Battle for Camelot. The dark forces that had been gathering on the edges of Camelot finally revealed themselves in a storm of chaos and destruction. The sky turned black with storm clouds, and the wind howled through the streets of the city as though the very air had turned against them. The ground trembled as the enemy approached, a force unlike anything Camelot had ever seen. Arthur stood at the gates of Camelot, Excalibur in hand, his knights gathered around him. They were ready to fight, ready to defend their kingdom to the last breath. But even as they prepared for battle, Arthur could feel the weight of the lady's warning pressing down on him. This battle would not be won by strength of arms alone. It would require more than just skill with a sword. It would require heart, honor, and sacrifice. The enemy came like a wave, sweeping over the land with a ferocity that seemed unstoppable. But Arthur and his knights stood firm, their swords flashing in the stormy darkness. The clash of steel rang out through the night, and the air was thick with the sounds of battle. But even as the battle raged, Arthur could feel the magic of Excalibur flowing through him, guiding his movements, giving him strength. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a beacon of hope, a symbol of the light that still burned in the heart of Camelot. And in the end, it was that light that won the day. Chapter 9. The Light of Camelot. The battle was over. The dark forces had been driven back, their power broken by the strength of Arthur and his knights. But the cost had been great. Many lives had been lost, and Camelot was left scarred by the battle. Arthur stood at the gates of the city, Excalibur still in hand, his heart heavy with both grief and triumph. The Lady of the Lake's words echoed in his mind. Excalibur is more than just a sword. It is a symbol of hope, of justice, and of the light that burns within you. Camelot had survived, but Arthur knew that the battle was not truly over. The darkness would always linger on the edges of the kingdom, waiting for a moment of weakness. But as long as the light of Camelot burned bright, as long as the people held on to hope, the kingdom would endure. As Arthur sheathed Excalibur, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The Lady of the Lake had given him the strength to protect his people, but it was the bond between him and his knights, the love they had for Camelot, that had truly saved the kingdom. And so, with the dawn breaking on the horizon and the promise of a new day ahead, Arthur knew that the story of Camelot was far from over. The Battle of Badon Hill. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. The air over Camelot was still, not the peaceful stillness of a quiet morning, but the heavy, oppressive kind that foreshadows a great storm. The sky above the kingdom had turned a muted gray, and a chill wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something darker. In the great hall of Camelot, King Arthur sat at the round table, his fingers tracing the grooves in the smooth wood. Around him sat his most trusted knights, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, and Galahad, all silent, their faces etched with concern. They had gathered here many times before, but today the tension was palpable. For weeks, rumors had been spreading of a great Saxon army marching toward Camelot. The Saxons, led by a fearsome warlord named Cerdic, had been pillaging villages along the borders, burning homes and fields, leaving destruction in their wake. It was clear that they were heading for Camelot, and Arthur knew that a great battle was coming, one that would decide the fate of the kingdom. Merlin stood at the edge of the room, his staff glowing faintly in the dim light. His face was lined with worry, though his eyes, sharp as ever, betrayed nothing. Arthur leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "The Saxons are moving quickly. They will be upon us in a matter of days." Lancelot, ever the stalwart knight, spoke first. "Then we will meet them on the field of battle. We have faced worse foes before." Arthur nodded, but his heart was heavy. He had fought many battles in his life, and while his knights had always fought valiantly, this one felt different. The Saxons were numerous, and their reputation for brutality was well known. There would be no easy victory. "We must choose where we will make our stand," Arthur said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his knights. "Badon Hill lies to the north. If we meet them there, we will have the advantage of the high ground." Gawain frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "Badon Hill is defensible, but the terrain is treacherous. If the weather turns against us, we could find ourselves trapped." "It's a risk we must take," Arthur replied. "We cannot let them reach Camelot." The room fell silent once more, each knight lost in his own thoughts. They had fought beside Arthur for years, each of them bound by honor and loyalty, but even the bravest of men felt the weight of the coming battle. They knew what was at stake, not just their lives, but the future of Camelot itself. After a long moment, Merlin stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "The Saxons are unlike any foe you have faced before. They are ruthless, and their numbers are vast. But there is something more, something darker at work." Arthur turned to the wizard, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Merlin's eyes gleamed with a strange light, and for a moment it seemed as though he could see beyond the walls of the hall, beyond the present moment, into the depths of the future. "There is a force guiding them," he said quietly. "A dark magic, ancient and powerful. It seeks to destroy all that you have built." Arthur's blood ran cold. Dark magic. He had faced many enemies in his time, but magic, especially ancient, malevolent magic, was a foe that could not be fought with swords and shields alone. "But there is hope," Merlin continued, his gaze locking onto Arthur's. "You are not without allies. The Lady of the Lake has blessed you with Excalibur, and the strength of your knights is unmatched. But you must be prepared, Arthur. This battle will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Arthur nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but he had no choice. Camelot was his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to protect his people. "We ride for Badon Hill at dawn," Arthur said, his voice filled with resolve. "May the gods watch over us." Chapter 2. The Ascent to Badon Hill. Dawn broke over the kingdom of Camelot, casting the sky in shades of pale blue and pink. The sound of horses' hooves echoed through the courtyard as Arthur and his knights prepared to depart. The air was cool and crisp, but there was a tension that hung over the men like a shroud. Arthur stood by his horse, tightening the straps of his saddle as his thoughts drifted to the battle ahead. His heart was heavy, and despite his outward calm, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was he leading his men into a battle they could not win? Would the strength of the Saxons and the dark magic behind them be too much for Camelot to withstand? He glanced over at Lancelot, who was checking the sharpness of his sword, his expression as stoic as ever. Lancelot had always been a pillar of strength, unwavering in his loyalty to Arthur and the Round Table. Gawain, too, stood nearby, his face serious as he adjusted his armor. And then there was Percival, the youngest of the knights, his wide eyes filled with determination, but also a flicker of fear. Arthur's heart ached as he looked at his men. They were more than just his knights. They were his friends, his brothers. And yet he could not shake the feeling that not all of them would return from the battle that awaited them. Merlin approached, his staff in hand, his gaze fixed on Arthur. "It is time, my king," he said quietly. Arthur nodded, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "We ride for Badon Hill," he called out to his knights. The group rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the rustle of wind through the trees. The path to Badon Hill was long and winding, leading them through dense forests and over rugged terrain. As they ascended the hill, the air grew colder and the wind picked up, tugging at their cloaks and filling the air with the scent of earth and rain. Arthur's thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Merlin the night before. Dark magic. The word sent a shiver down his spine. He had seen magic before, of course. Merlin's magic had saved them more times than he could count. But this was different. This was ancient, primal, and malevolent. And it was guiding the Saxons straight to Camelot. They reached the top of Badon Hill as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The view from the top was breathtaking. Rolling hills and forests stretched out as far as the eye could see, but the beauty of the scene was marred by the knowledge of the battle to come. The knights dismounted, their faces set with grim determination as they began to set up their defenses. The hill was steep, and they would have the advantage of the high ground, but Arthur knew that the Saxons would come in force. They would need every ounce of strength, every drop of courage to stand against them. As the sun sank lower, casting the sky in shades of orange and red, Arthur stood at the edge of the hill, Excalibur hanging at his side. The sword was a comforting weight, its magic thrumming through him like a steady heartbeat. But even Excalibur could not quell the fear that gnawed at his gut. Merlin joined him, his staff glowing faintly in the twilight. "The Saxons will be here by morning," he said quietly. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know." Merlin's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur saw something in the wizard's eyes that he had not seen before. Uncertainty. "This battle will not be like any you have fought before," Merlin said, his voice low. "The dark magic that guides the Saxons is powerful. It seeks not just to conquer Camelot, but to destroy it, to erase it from history. Arthur's grip tightened on the hilt of Excalibur. Then we will meet them with everything we have. Merlin nodded, though his expression remained grave. Be careful, Arthur. The darkness will try to corrupt you. It will seek out your fears, your doubts, and use them against you. Arthur's heart clenched at the warning, but he forced himself to remain calm. I will not fall to the darkness, Merlin. Camelot is my duty, and I will protect it with my life. The wizard's eyes gleamed with an ancient sadness. I pray that will be enough. Chapter 3. The Saxon Horde. The morning arrived with a thick, oppressive mist that clung to the earth like a shroud. The sun, though risen, barely penetrated the dense fog that had settled over Badon Hill. The world was quiet, save for the distant rustling of the wind through the trees, and the tension among the knights was palpable. Arthur stood at the top of the hill, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He could see little beyond the mist, but he knew what lay ahead. The Saxons were coming. Their army was vast, and their warlord, Cerdic, was a brutal leader, known for his merciless tactics. But it wasn't just the Saxons that Arthur feared. It was the dark magic that Merlin had spoken of, the malevolent force that guided them. He could feel it in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The mist itself seemed unnatural, as though it were alive, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Lancelot approached, his sword in hand, his face set in grim determination. The men are ready, he said quietly. Arthur nodded, his gaze still fixed on the mist below. Good, we'll hold the high ground. Let them come to us. Lancelot glanced at him, concern flickering in his eyes. Are you sure about this, Arthur? We don't know what we're up against. Arthur's grip tightened on Excalibur. We don't have a choice, Lancelot. We stand here, or we let them march on Camelot. And I won't let that happen. Lancelot hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his jaw clenched. Then we fight. The sound of war drums echoed through the mist, a deep rhythmic pounding that sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. The Saxons were coming. He could hear the distant clang of metal, the low rumble of their war horns, growing louder with each passing moment. Arthur turned to his knights who stood at the ready, their faces pale but resolute. Gawain, ever brave, stood at the front, his sword drawn, his eyes burning with determination. Percival, young and full of fire, looked to Arthur for guidance, his hand steady on the hilt of his sword, and Galahad, pure of heart, stood tall and unflinching, his gaze fixed on the mist below. Arthur drew Excalibur, the blade gleaming with an otherworldly light, its magic thrumming through him. "Stand strong!" he called to his men. "For Camelot!" The knights raised their swords, their voices ringing out as one. "For Camelot!" The war drums grew louder, the sound reverberating through the earth beneath their feet. And then, from the mist, the Saxon horde appeared. They came like a flood, their numbers seemingly endless. Warriors clad in furs and iron, their faces twisted with rage, charged up the hill with a ferocity that shook the very ground. At their head was Cerdic, a massive figure clad in black armor, his eyes burning with hatred as he led his men into battle. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as the first wave of Saxons crashed against their defenses. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the air was filled with the sounds of battle. The Knights of Camelot fought bravely, their swords flashing in the morning light as they held the line against the onslaught. But the Saxons were relentless, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm them. Arthur fought with everything he had, Excalibur cutting through the enemy like a blade through water. But even with the sword's magic, the battle was brutal. He could feel the dark magic at work, an insidious force that whispered in his mind, trying to sow doubt and fear. But he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. He could not afford to falter, not now. Chapter 4. The Tide Turns. As the battle raged on, the mist seemed to thicken, swirling around them like a living thing. Arthur's muscles ached, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought off wave after wave of Saxons. His knights fought valiantly beside him, but they were tiring, their movements slowing as exhaustion began to take its toll. Cerdic's war cries echoed through the battlefield, his black armor gleaming in the dim light as he cut down knight after knight. He was a force of nature, his strength seemingly endless, and as he advanced, it became clear that the Saxons were gaining ground. Arthur's heart sank as he watched his men begin to fall back, their defenses crumbling under the weight of the Saxon assault. The high ground had given them an advantage, but it was not enough. The Saxons were too many, too strong, and the dark magic that guided them only made matters worse. Merlin appeared at Arthur's side, his face pale and his staff glowing with a faint light. "The magic is stronger than I anticipated," he said, his voice tight with strain. "It's feeding off the fear, the chaos." Arthur's grip tightened on Excalibur, his mind racing. He could feel the magic pressing down on him, trying to twist his thoughts, to make him believe that all was lost. But he could not, would not, let it win. "There must be something we can do," Arthur said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Merlin hesitated, his gaze distant as though he were searching for something just out of reach. "There may be a way," he said at last, "but it will require a great sacrifice." Arthur's heart clenched at the word. Sacrifice. He had known from the beginning that this battle would not come without cost, but the weight of Merlin's words made the reality of it all the more stark. "What must I do?" Arthur asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Merlin's eyes met his, filled with a sadness that spoke of centuries of knowledge. "You must call upon the full power of Excalibur, but in doing so, you may lose yourself." Arthur's blood ran cold. He had felt the power of Excalibur before, the way it thrummed with magic, the way it connected him to something far greater than himself, but he had never fully unleashed its power, never allowed it to consume him. And yet, he knew that Merlin was right. There was no other way. The Saxons were too strong, the dark magic too powerful. If he did not act now, Camelot would fall. With a deep breath, Arthur nodded, his decision made. "Then I will do what must be done." Merlin's expression softened, though the sadness remained. "You are a great king, Arthur. Whatever happens, know that you have already saved Camelot." Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he turned to face the battlefield, Excalibur heavy in his hand. The mist swirled around him, thick and oppressive, but he could feel the power of the sword thrumming through him, stronger than ever before. With a deep breath, Arthur raised Excalibur high above his head, the blade gleaming with an otherworldly light. The air around him seemed to still, the sounds of battle fading as the sword's magic began to awaken. And then, with a single powerful stroke, Arthur brought the sword down, unleashing the full power of Excalibur. Chapter 5. The Light of Excalibur. The moment Excalibur struck the ground, a wave of pure, blinding light erupted from the sword, spreading out across the battlefield like a ripple in a pond. The light was so bright, so intense, that it seemed to banish the very darkness itself, cutting through the mist and the fog like a knife through shadow. Arthur felt the magic surge through him, filling every part of his being with a strength and power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The light of Excalibur was ancient, older than Camelot itself, and as it flowed through him, Arthur could feel the weight of centuries of magic, the power of kings long gone. The Saxons faltered as the light swept over them, their war cries turning to shouts of fear as they tried to shield their eyes from the blinding brilliance. The dark magic that had guided them seemed to waver, its hold weakening as the light of Excalibur grew stronger. Arthur could feel the sword's power pulsing in his hands, a living thing that seemed to have a will of its own. It was more than just a weapon. It was a force of nature, a beacon of hope and justice, and in that moment, Arthur knew that the battle was turning. But even as the light drove back the darkness, Arthur felt a strange sensation begin to creep over him. The magic of Excalibur was powerful, yes, but it was also dangerous. He could feel it pressing against the edges of his mind, trying to take control, trying to consume him. He gritted his teeth, fighting to maintain control as the power surged through him. He could not let it take him, not now. He had to stay strong, for Camelot, for his knights, for everything he had fought to protect. With a final burst of strength, Arthur drove the Saxons back, their army retreating in disarray as the light of Excalibur continued to blaze across the battlefield. The dark magic that had once guided them was broken, and without it, their resolve crumbled. Arthur's knights rallied, their swords flashing in the light as they drove the Saxons down the hill, cutting through their ranks with a renewed sense of hope and strength. The tide had turned. Camelot would not fall. Chapter 6. A King's Burden. The battle was won, but the cost was great. As the last of the Saxons fled into the mist, Arthur stood at the top of Badon Hill, Excalibur still glowing faintly in his hand. His body was weary, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, but it was his mind that bore the true weight of the battle. The power of Excalibur had saved them, but it had also taken something from him. He could feel it, a part of himself, lost to the magic, to the ancient force that had guided the sword. He had called upon its full power, and in doing so, he had paid a price. Merlin approached, his face lined with worry as he placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "Camelot is safe because of you." Arthur nodded, though the weight of the victory pressed down on him like a great stone. "But at what cost?" Merlin's eyes softened, and for a moment he looked as though he were about to speak. But instead he simply nodded, his gaze distant, as though he could see something far beyond the present moment. The Knights of Camelot gathered around Arthur, their faces weary but filled with gratitude. Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, and Galahad all stood by his side, their swords sheathed, their expressions solemn. "You saved us, Arthur," Lancelot said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You saved Camelot." Arthur looked at his knights, his friends, his brothers, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of their loyalty, their love. He had led them into battle, and they had followed him without hesitation. And now they stood together, victorious, but not without loss. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the battlefield. The mist had cleared, and the world seemed to breathe once more. But even as the dawn broke, Arthur knew that the battle had taken its toll, not just on him, but on Camelot. He sheathed Excalibur, the sword's magic fading as the light of the sun grew stronger. "Camelot is safe," he said quietly, "but the darkness is not gone. It will return." Merlin's eyes gleamed with ancient wisdom as he nodded. "Yes, Arthur, but you are not alone. You never have been." Arthur's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow as he looked out over the land he had fought so hard to protect. The battle of Badon Hill had been won, but the true battle, the battle for the soul of Camelot, was far from over. And so, as the dawn broke and the mist cleared, Arthur knew that the story of Camelot was not yet finished. For the next tale, dear listener, will lead us deeper into the heart of betrayal and redemption as we follow the legend of the death of King Arthur, a story of sacrifice, loyalty, and the ultimate test of the bonds that hold Camelot together. The Death of King Arthur. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Betrayal. The first cold winds of winter had begun to sweep across Camelot, biting through the thick walls of the castle and rustling the banners that hung in the great hall. The sun, though still bright, seemed to cast longer shadows as it sank lower in the sky, as though the light itself was hesitant to linger in the kingdom. King Arthur stood at the window of his chamber, gazing out over the landscape. The fields beyond the walls were barren, the trees stripped of their leaves, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. In the distance, the shimmering towers of Camelot stood tall, but even they seemed somehow diminished, their grandeur muted by the chill in the air. Arthur's heart felt heavy. It had been weeks since the Battle of Badon Hill, and though Camelot had been saved, the kingdom had not returned to the peace and prosperity it had once known. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something dark was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then there was Mordred. Arthur's nephew Mordred had always been an ambitious young man, but lately that ambition had begun to twist into something darker, something more dangerous. There had been whispers among the court, rumors that Mordred sought to take the throne for himself. And though Arthur had tried to dismiss those whispers as baseless gossip, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth in them. The betrayal weighed heavily on Arthur's mind, more so than any battle he had ever fought. Mordred was family, blood of his blood, and yet Arthur sensed the growing rift between them, as though the very fabric of their relationship was unraveling. He had raised Mordred, loved him as a son, but now, standing at the edge of what felt like a precipice, Arthur could not see a way forward that did not end in tragedy. The door to his chamber creaked open, and Merlin stepped inside, his staff tapping softly against the stone floor. The wizard's silver beard glimmered faintly in the low light, and his eyes, though wise and knowing, were filled with concern. "You are troubled, Arthur," Merlin said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge. Arthur sighed, his gaze still fixed on the barren landscape beyond the window. "Mordred," he replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. "He grows more distant with each passing day. I fear he is being drawn toward a path that will lead to ruin." Merlin nodded slowly, his expression grim. "The darkness that has plagued Camelot has not yet been vanquished. It lingers still, and I fear it has found a foothold in Mordred's heart." Arthur turned to face Merlin, his chest tightening at the wizard's words. "He is my nephew, Merlin, my blood. I cannot believe that he would turn against me." Merlin's eyes softened, and for a moment Arthur saw not the powerful sorcerer who had guided him through so many trials, but an old man who had seen far too much pain in his long life. "Betrayal is often born of love, Arthur. The heart can be a dangerous thing when twisted by ambition and fear." Arthur's fists clenched at his sides. He had faced many enemies in his time as king: Saxons, sorcerers, dark forces that sought to destroy Camelot. But this felt different. This was personal. And it was that personal nature of the conflict that made it all the more unbearable. "What am I to do?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Merlin was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as though he were peering into the future, searching for answers. "The road ahead is unclear," he said at last. "But I fear that a great battle is coming, one that will test you in ways no battle ever has before." Arthur's heart sank. He had known deep down that there would be no easy resolution to this conflict, but hearing Merlin's words made it all the more real. "I cannot fight him," Arthur said, his voice filled with anguish. "I cannot fight my own blood." Merlin's expression was filled with sorrow as he stepped closer, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You are a great king, Arthur, but even the greatest kings must face choices they wish they did not have to make." Arthur closed his eyes, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He knew that Merlin was right, but that did not make the burden any easier to bear. Chapter 2: Mordred's Rising Ambition. In the dimly lit halls of Camelot, where shadows clung to the corners like secrets, Mordred paced restlessly. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with thoughts he could no longer suppress. His once youthful ambition had grown into something darker, an insatiable hunger for power that gnawed at him day and night. For years Mordred had served Arthur faithfully, earning his place among the Knights of the Round Table. But as time passed, he had begun to feel overshadowed by his uncle's greatness. No matter how many battles he fought, no matter how many victories he achieved, he was always in Arthur's shadow. And then there was the throne. Mordred had watched as Arthur ruled over Camelot with wisdom and strength, admired by all. But the more he watched, the more he felt that the throne should be his. He was of royal blood, after all, Arthur's blood. Why should he not rule? Why should he not be king? The whispers had started long ago, at first quiet, almost imperceptible. But now they filled his mind like a chorus, urging him to seize what he believed was rightfully his. "You are stronger than Arthur. You are the true king. Take what is yours." Mordred stopped pacing, his gaze shifting to the dark window that overlooked the courtyard below. The wind howled outside, rattling the panes of glass, and for a moment Mordred saw his reflection, a young man with sharp features and eyes filled with anger. But behind that reflection, he saw something else, something darker. Mordred. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down Mordred's spine. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, save for the flickering torchlight that danced along the stone walls. "Who's there?" Mordred demanded, his voice tense. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, the voice returned, this time louder, more insistent. "You know who I am." Mordred's heart raced as he scanned the shadows, searching for the source of the voice. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, clad in a cloak as black as night, their face hidden beneath a hood. But even without seeing the figure's face, Mordred knew who it was. Morgan Le Fay, his mother. The dark sorceress had long been an enemy of Arthur, her ambitions as dangerous as her magic. Mordred had not seen her in years, but he had always known that she lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. "Mordred," Morgan said, her voice smooth and dangerous, "it is time." Mordred stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Time for what?" Morgan stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Time for you to take your rightful place on the throne. Time for you to become king." Mordred's breath caught in his throat. It was as though she had plucked the thoughts from his mind, giving voice to the ambitions he had tried so hard to keep hidden. "But Arthur is weak," Morgan interrupted, her voice sharp. "He is old and his time is ending. You are the future, Mordred. You are the rightful king of Camelot." Mordred's mind raced. Everything she said resonated with the deepest parts of him, the parts that had grown bitter and resentful over the years. He had always been meant for more. He had always been meant to rule. But still a part of him hesitated, a small flickering light that reminded him of the loyalty he had once felt for Arthur, the man who had raised him, the man who had trusted him. "Arthur is your uncle," Morgan said softly, as though reading his thoughts. "But he is also your enemy. He stands in the way of your destiny. If you do not act, you will be nothing more than a footnote in his story." Mordred clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He could feel the war raging inside him, his ambition battling against the remnants of his loyalty to Arthur. But as he stared into Morgan's eyes, he felt the balance tip. "I will take the throne," Mordred said, his voice cold and resolute. "Arthur's time is over." Morgan smiled, a dark, satisfied smile. "Good," she purred. "Very good." Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The next few weeks passed in a blur of tense anticipation. Word had spread through the kingdom that Mordred was gathering supporters, knights and nobles who, for reasons of their own, had begun to turn away from Arthur and look toward Mordred as the future king. Arthur had watched the shift with growing unease, though he had done his best to maintain a sense of calm. He could not show weakness, not now, not when the kingdom was already on edge after the recent battles. But deep down, Arthur knew that the conflict with Mordred was inevitable. In the great hall, the once harmonious round table had begun to fracture. Mordred's presence at the table was a constant reminder of the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. There were moments when Arthur caught Mordred's gaze across the table, moments when their eyes met, and Arthur saw not the nephew he had raised, but a rival, a threat. One evening, as the knights gathered for a council meeting, the tension finally broke. The hall was quiet, the air thick with unspoken conflict. Arthur sat at the head of the round table, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of the wood. Mordred sat directly across from him, his eyes narrowed, his posture rigid. The other knights glanced nervously between the two of them, their unease palpable. "I have heard troubling reports," Arthur began, his voice steady but laced with a warning. "Reports that you, Mordred, are rallying men to your cause, that you seek to challenge my rule." Mordred didn't flinch. He met Arthur's gaze head-on, his expression cold and unyielding. "You have ruled long enough, uncle," he said, his voice calm but filled with barely concealed defiance. "It is time for new leadership. Time for Camelot to have a king who is not afraid to embrace the future." Arthur's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sorrow. He had known this moment would come, but that did not make it any less painful. "And you believe that king should be you?" Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. Mordred didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am of royal blood. Am I not? Why should I not rule?" Lancelot, who had been sitting quietly, his brow furrowed in concern, finally spoke. "Mordred, this is madness. Arthur has led us through countless battles, protected this kingdom from enemies within and without. You cannot—" "I can," Mordred interrupted, his voice sharp. "And I will." The hall fell into a tense silence. The weight of Mordred's words hung in the air, suffocating the room like a heavy fog. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained impassive. He could not let Mordred see his fear, his doubt. "If you seek to take the throne by force," Arthur said quietly, "then you leave me no choice but to defend it." Mordred's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "Then defend it, uncle, if you can." Chapter 4. The Battle of Camlan. The day of the battle dawned cold and bleak, the sky a dull gray that seemed to mirror the mood of the men who prepared for the coming conflict. Camlan, the site of the final confrontation between Arthur and Mordred, was a desolate stretch of land, barren and windswept, with jagged hills rising in the distance. Arthur stood at the head of his army, Excalibur gleaming at his side. The sword felt heavier than usual, its magic thrumming faintly, as though it too sensed the gravity of the situation. The wind tugged at his cloak, and the cold air bit at his skin, but Arthur felt none of it. His mind was focused solely on the battle ahead, the battle that would decide the fate of Camelot. On the opposite side of the field, Mordred stood with his own army, a dark figure clad in black armor, his eyes burning with hatred and ambition. Behind him, the men he had rallied to his cause stood ready, their faces grim and determined. Arthur's heart ached as he looked at his nephew, the boy he had raised, the boy he had loved. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man consumed by ambition and the desire for power. Merlin stood beside Arthur, his staff glowing faintly as he surveyed the battlefield. "This will be the end," Merlin said quietly, "one way or another." Arthur nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know." The two armies stood facing each other, the tension between them so thick it felt like a physical force. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world holding its breath as the fate of Camelot hung in the balance. And then, with a deafening roar, the battle began. The clash of steel rang out across the field as the two armies collided, swords and shields flashing in the dim light. Arthur fought at the front, Excalibur cutting through the enemy with deadly precision. His knights fought beside him, their loyalty unwavering even in the face of betrayal. But Mordred's forces were strong, and the battle was brutal. Men fell on both sides, their cries of pain echoing across the battlefield. The ground beneath their feet became slick with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. Arthur fought with everything he had, but even as he cut down his enemies, he could feel his strength waning. His muscles ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred as exhaustion began to take its toll. And then through the chaos of battle, Arthur saw him, Mordred, standing in the midst of the fray, his sword raised high, his eyes locked on Arthur. Their gazes met across the battlefield, and in that moment, Arthur knew that the final confrontation had come. With a roar, Arthur charged toward Mordred, Excalibur gleaming in his hand. Mordred met him head-on, their swords clashing with a force that reverberated through the air. The two men fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, their blades flashing in the dim light as they traded blows. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that they were evenly matched. For every strike Arthur landed, Mordred returned it with equal force. The clash of steel echoed across the battlefield as the two men fought, their swords flashing in the dim light. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but he could not, would not, give up. But then, in a moment of hesitation, Mordred struck. His sword found its mark, piercing Arthur's side with a sickening thud. Arthur gasped, his hand instinctively moving to the wound as pain shot through his body. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Arthur staggered, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay on his feet. He could feel the life draining from him, the strength that had carried him through so many battles slipping away. But even as the darkness closed in, Arthur refused to fall. With a final desperate surge of strength, Arthur raised Excalibur high above his head and brought it down upon Mordred, the blade cutting through the air with a blinding flash of light. Mordred's eyes widened in shock as the sword struck, his body crumpling to the ground in a pool of blood. The battle was over. Chapter 5. The Final Farewell. Arthur stood over Mordred's lifeless body, Excalibur hanging limply in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision swam as the pain from his wound intensified. He had won, but at what cost? The battlefield was littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with a stench of death and smoke. The Knights of Camelot stood in silence, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion as they looked upon their fallen comrades. Merlin appeared at Arthur's side, his face pale and lined with sorrow. "It is over," he said quietly. Arthur nodded, though the victory felt hollow. His body ached, his mind heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. Camelot had been saved, but the cost had been great. "I must go," Arthur said, his voice weak. Merlin's eyes widened in alarm. "Arthur, you are gravely wounded. You cannot—" "I must," Arthur interrupted, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Take me to the lake." Merlin hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his expression filled with sadness. He knew what Arthur meant. The time had come. Chapter 6. The Journey to Avalon. The journey to the Lake of Mysteries was long and arduous, each step a painful reminder of Arthur's wound. The cold wind bit at his skin, and the sky above was dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Merlin walked beside him, his staff glowing faintly in the dim light. The wizard's face was lined with sorrow, but his eyes remained calm, steady, as though he had known this moment would come all along. When they reached the lake, the mist was thick and swirling, casting strange shadows on the water's surface. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and magic, and for a moment Arthur felt as though he were standing on the edge of another world. Merlin stepped forward, his voice quiet but filled with reverence. "The Lady of the Lake will guide you now, Arthur. She has waited for this moment." Arthur nodded, his heart heavy with both sorrow and acceptance. He had known deep down that this day would come. His time as king had been filled with triumphs and tragedies, victories and losses. But now it was time to lay down his sword. As he stood at the edge of the lake, the mist parted, and from the water the Lady of the Lake emerged once more. Her eyes were filled with a deep, ancient wisdom, and as she approached, Arthur felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. She held out her hand, and with a soft, sad smile, she spoke. "Come, Arthur, it is time." With a final heavy breath, Arthur handed Excalibur to the lady, the sword gleaming in the pale light as it disappeared beneath the water. Arthur's legs gave way, and he sank to the ground, his body finally giving in to the pain and exhaustion that had been building for so long. Merlin knelt beside him, his hand resting gently on Arthur's shoulder. "You have done well, Arthur. Camelot will endure because of you." Arthur smiled weakly, his vision fading as the darkness closed in. Tell them I will return when they need me most." Merlin nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I will." And with that, Arthur closed his eyes, his body falling still as the last breath left his lungs. But even as the King of Camelot passed from this world, the legend of King Arthur lived on.